After the fire, my son refused to help me. The person who saved me landed in a helicopter. My son panicked when he realized what he'd done. I'm 68 years old, and I learned something terrible that morning my house burned down. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, but gratitude does. The son I gave birth to slammed his mansion door in my face while I stood there smelling like smoke and despair. But the boy I took in 28 years ago, the one who wasn't mine by blood, dropped everything and flew across 3 states to save me. And when my biological son discovered exactly who that boy had become, the color drained from his face faster than my savings had drained into his college fund. This is the story of how I lost everything in 10 minutes, was abandoned by the child I raised, and was rescued by the child I chose. It's about helicopters, hidden fortunes, and the moment a mother realizes her real son was the one she fed at her table out of kindness, not obligation. If you want to know how a fire revealed which of my boys actually loved me, and how karma has a way of keeping perfect records, stay with me. You're going to want to hear this. The smell came first, that chemical, suffocating odor that makes your chest tighten. Then gray smoke crawled under my bedroom door like something alive. When I opened it, the hallway was an orange nightmare. I didn't think, just grabbed my embroidered purse and ran. Heat scorched my back as flames ate 40 years of my life. Outside, while neighbors called emergency services, I watched each window explode. Every blast was a memory dying, Gabriel's baby photos, my grandmother's piano, the jewelry I'd planned to leave my granddaughter. The fire chief used that voice people use when they're trying to be gentle. Total loss, old wiring. 40 years reduced to rubble and 2 cold words. I stood there clutching my purse while Dawn painted the ashes pink. I had nothing, no clothes, no documents, nowhere to sleep that night. And in that moment, smoke still burning my lungs, I could only think one thing. I needed my son. Gabriel lived 40 minutes from what used to be my house. With shaking hands, I dialed. His voice sounded annoyed. It was 6 a.m. I told him my house had burned, that I had nothing. A long, cold silence. He said he couldn't talk right now. He and Beatrice had an important dinner that evening. My heart sank. I begged him, said I had nowhere to go. Another silence, longer, colder. Fine, he finally said. Come over. But just for today, understand? Just to get organized. Donna Lucia lent me 50 reis for the taxi. During the entire ride, I gripped my purse like it was the only thing connecting me to the person I was yesterday. Gabriel's house is in Leblon, a 3-story mansion, enormous windows, 2 late-model SUVs parked outside. My son had gone far. Financial director at a multinational, earning more in a month than I'd earned in years. Beatrice opened the door. 33 years old, tall, thin, with the kind of beauty that intimidates. She looked me up and down, my clothes reeking of smoke, my face streaked with soot, and her mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. She said my name like it hurt her tongue. She didn't invite me in, just stood there blocking the entrance. Gabriel appeared behind her. My son. The boy I'd carried in my arms, fed, nursed through pneumonia at age 5. That boy was now a 40-year-old man in an Italian suit and a watch worth more than my house. Our eyes met, and then something happened I'll never forget. Gabriel looked at Beatrice. She looked back, and they both laughed. Not nervous laughter, mockery, as if my presence at their door was the most absurd joke in the world. He said it looked like his mother wanted to live there, still wearing that half-smile. I tried to speak, but he interrupted, his tone the same he'd use with an annoying street vendor. He told me there was no room for a burden like me. He and Beatrice had their organized life. They couldn't be taking care of situations. That's what he called my tragedy. Beatrice put her hand on Gabriel's shoulder, possessive. She said they had commitments. She was sure I understood. And then Gabriel closed the door. Didn't slam it. Closed it slowly, calmly, like someone closing the refrigerator after seeing there's nothing interesting inside. I stood there on my son's mansion steps, morning sun warming my back and the ice of his rejection freezing my soul. I walked back to the street with trembling legs, not from exhaustion, but from something worse, the kind of pain that makes you question everything you thought you knew about love, about family, about who you are. And then, sitting on the curb of a neighborhood that would never be my home, I remembered someone who didn't share my blood, but perhaps shared something more important. Heart pounding, I called Mateus, because if my own son had shut the door in my face, maybe the boy I'd raised without him being mine, who'd slept on my couch and eaten at my table when nobody else wanted him, still remembered what loyalty means. His voice, that voice which 28 years ago was high-pitched and scared, now deep and confident, still called me Mom. I told him my house had burned, that I had nothing. His tone changed immediately. He asked where I was. I said I was at Gabriel's house, but he asked what Gabriel had done, the question sharp as a razor. I couldn't answer, just cried. He told me to send my exact location, that he'd be there in 90 minutes, not to move. And I knew he'd keep that promise, unlike my blood son, who'd forgotten every promise he ever made me. I sat on that curb for 20 minutes before a black Mercedes pulled up. Not Mateus, he'd said 90 minutes. A woman in her 50s stepped out, elegant, with kind eyes. She introduced herself as Sophia, explained that Mateus had called her, that she lived nearby and he'd asked her to get me immediately. She insisted I come to her apartment. Wouldn't take no for an answer. In her living room, wrapped in a borrowed robe, while my smoke-damaged clothes tumbled in her washing machine, Sophia brought me tea. She said Mateus had been her son's best friend since childhood, that he'd called in a panic saying his mother needed help. The way she said his mother, with such naturalness, made my throat tight. I wasn't Mateus's mother by blood, but apparently I was his mother in every way that mattered. Sophia asked what had happened with Gabriel. I found myself telling her everything, not just about that morning, but about the past 5 years. How Gabriel's calls became less frequent after he married Beatrice. How his visits stopped entirely after their daughter was born. How I'd met my granddaughter exactly 3 times in 4 years, and always at their convenience, never mine. How every birthday card I sent came back with a polite thank you text, nothing more. But here's what I hadn't told anyone, what I'd been too ashamed to admit even to myself. 2 years ago, Gabriel had asked me to co-sign a business loan. 200,000 reais. He'd said it was a guaranteed investment, that he'd pay me back within 6 months with interest. I'd used my house as collateral, the house that had just burned down. The house I'd paid off over 30 years of working double shifts as a nurse. Gabriel never paid me back. Not 1 real. When I asked about it after a year, he'd gotten irritated, said I didn't understand business, that these things took time. When I pressed harder 6 months ago, desperate because my roof was leaking and I couldn't afford repairs, he'd stopped answering my calls altogether. Sophia's face darkened as I talked. She asked if I had any documentation. I opened my purse, the only thing I'd saved from the fire, and there it was. I always kept my important papers in that purse. The loan documents, the collateral agreement. Gabriel's signature next to mine, promising joint responsibility. Sophia pulled out her phone and made a call. She asked someone named Dr. Campos if he could come over, said it was urgent. She told me Dr. Campos was a lawyer, one of the best in Rio, and a close friend. Within 40 minutes, he was sitting in Sophia's living room, reading my documents with increasingly tight lips. Dr. Campos looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He asked if I knew what this meant. The loan was in both our names, but the collateral was solely my property. Gabriel had used my house to guarantee money for his business without putting up any of his own assets. And now that the house was gone, destroyed, the bank would come after whatever I had left, which was nothing. But Gabriel, Dr. Campos explained carefully, was legally responsible for half that debt. And if I couldn't pay and the collateral was gone, the bank could go after Gabriel's assets instead. His house, his cars, his investment accounts. Everything Gabriel had built could be seized to pay a debt he'd promised to handle, but never did. My hands started shaking. I asked what would happen to me. Dr. Campos was quiet for a moment, then said that depended on several factors, but that I should know something else. He'd pulled Gabriel's business records while we talked. The company Gabriel claimed he needed the loan for? It didn't exist. There was no business registration, no tax filings, nothing. Gabriel had taken 200,000 reais secured against my house for a company that never existed. The room tilted. Sophia grabbed my arm, steadied me. I couldn't breathe properly. My son, had lied to me, used me, stolen from me using legal paperwork I'd signed because I trusted him. Because he was my child, and parents are supposed to trust their children. And then my phone rang. Gabriel. My hand hovered over it, shaking. Sophia told me to answer, to put it on speaker. I did. Gabriel's voice was tight, angry. He demanded to know where I was, said I'd embarrassed him by sitting on his curb for so long, that his neighbors had seen me, that Beatrice was mortified. He said I needed to figure out my situation and stop being dramatic. Then he added something that made my blood freeze. He hoped I'd gotten insurance money from the fire because he certainly couldn't afford to help me, and I'd better not come crying to him about that old loan. That old loan. He said it so casually, like it wasn't my entire life he'd gambled away. Dr. Campos leaned forward, his eyes sharp. He gestured for me to ask Gabriel about the business, about what he'd used the money for. My voice trembled as I asked. Gabriel laughed, actually laughed, and told me I wouldn't understand, that it was complicated business matters, that I should just trust that he'd handle it eventually. Then he hung up. Sophia's apartment was silent except for my ragged breathing. Dr. Campos tapped his pen against his notepad, thinking. Finally, he said we had options. But I needed to understand something first. Going after Gabriel legally would destroy whatever relationship we had left. I looked at him and heard myself say something I never thought I'd say about my own son. We didn't have a relationship left to destroy. Dr. Campos nodded slowly, said he'd need a few days to build a case, to gather more evidence about Gabriel's finances and the non-existent company. He told me not to sign anything, not to talk to the bank, not to communicate with Gabriel without him present. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. Did I have anywhere to stay while this got sorted out? I shook my head, tears finally spilling over. And that's when Sophia's apartment door flew open and Mateus walked in, and I understood for the first time what it means when people say someone takes your breath away. 28 years ago, Mateus was a skinny 12-year-old whose mother had abandoned him and whose father drank away their rent money. My neighbor found him sleeping in their building's parking garage in December, wearing a t-shirt in winter. I brought him home, fed him, and told him he could stay until his situation improved. He stayed for 6 years, until he was 18 and left for the military. The man who walked through Sophia's door looked nothing like that scared boy. Tall, confident, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. But his eyes, those were the same eyes that used to watch me fearfully from my couch, like he couldn't believe someone was being kind without wanting something in return. Mateus crossed the room in 3 strides and wrapped me in a hug that made me sob like a child. He kept saying he was sorry, so sorry he hadn't been there sooner. I tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, but he cut me off gently, said nothing that happened today was my fault, and we'd fix everything. Sophia introduced him to Dr. Campos, and I watched something shift in the lawyer's posture, recognition, maybe respect. Mateus asked Dr. Campos to explain everything, and as the lawyer went through it all again, the loan, the fake company, Gabriel's betrayal, Mateus's jaw got tighter and tighter. When Dr. Campos finished, Mateus was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the lawyer what the fastest legal route was to protect me and recover the money. Dr. Campos explained it could take months, maybe years, and even then there were no guarantees. The bank would have priority claims on any assets, and Gabriel was good at hiding money if he'd managed to fool everyone with a fake company. Mateus pulled out his phone and made a call. He asked someone named Costa to pull everything on Gabriel Henrique Alves. Said he needed a complete financial workup by tomorrow morning, every account, every asset, every transaction over 50,000 reais in the past 3 years. Then he made another call, this one to someone he called Ricardo, explained the situation in technical terms I barely understood, something about leveraging debt obligations and accelerating collateral claims. I stared at him. Sophia smiled slightly. Dr. Campos looked impressed. When Mateus hung up, I asked him what he did for a living. He said he owned a consulting firm that specialized in financial recovery and asset management. Then he added, almost embarrassed, that he'd done well for himself and wanted me to know I'd never have to worry about money again. I started crying again, but this time from something other than despair. Mateus knelt in front of me, took my hands, and said I'd given him a home when he had nothing, that I'd fed him and clothed him and treated him like I'd given birth to him myself. He told me Gabriel was an idiot and that blood didn't make someone family. Love did. Over the next 3 days, I stayed in Sophia's guest room while Mateus worked. He visited every morning, bringing fresh clothes in my size, my favorite foods, flowers. He'd sit with me over coffee and tell me about his life, the military career that taught him discipline, the business degree he earned while serving, the company he started 5 years ago that now employed 200 people across 3 states. He also told me about the investigators he'd hired. Gabriel's financial situation was worse than anyone knew. The mansion in Leblon was mortgaged to the ceiling. The cars were leased. Beatrice's spending was astronomical. Her closet alone contained over 300,000 reais in designer clothes and bags. They were drowning in debt, living a lifestyle they couldn't afford, desperately trying to maintain appearances. And the 200,000 reais Gabriel had taken from me? Mateus's investigators found it. Gabriel had used it to cover their basic living expenses for 6 months. Rent, car payments, Beatrice's shopping habits. There was no business, no investment. Just a desperate man robbing his mother to maintain his wife's luxury lifestyle. Dr. Campos advised that we had a strong fraud case. The fake company, the misuse of funds, the abandonment after the fire, it all painted a damning picture. But he warned that prosecuting would be slow and public. Gabriel would fight back, probably claim I was a confused old woman who didn't understand what she'd signed. It would get ugly. Mateus asked if there was another way, something faster. Dr. Campos considered this, then suggested we might leverage Gabriel's desperation instead. If Gabriel was already drowning in debt, the threat of legal action might be enough to force negotiation, especially if Gabriel knew that Mateus had the resources to bury him. I asked what that meant. Mateus explained carefully. We could approach Gabriel with an offer. I'd forgive the loan debt if he signed over certain assets to cover the loss. Not all his assets, just enough to make me whole. It would save him from prosecution and public humiliation. But for it to work, Gabriel couldn't know about Mateus's involvement yet. Gabriel needed to think I was just a helpless old woman who'd somehow gotten a lawyer, not someone backed by serious money and power. Dr. Campos liked this approach. He said he'd contact Gabriel's office, request a meeting to discuss the loan situation, present it as an attempt to settle matters before involving the bank and authorities. We'd offer Gabriel a way out, but the terms would be non-negotiable and time-sensitive. That night, lying in Sophia's guest bed, I thought about everything. My house was gone. My relationship with my son was destroyed. Or maybe it had been destroyed years ago, and I'd just been too blind to see it. But I had Mateus, who'd flown across 3 states the moment I called. I had Sophia, who'd opened her home to a stranger. I had Dr. Campos, fighting for me without asking for payment up front. The next morning, Gabriel's assistant called Dr. Campos back. Gabriel would meet with us, but only if I wasn't present. He refused to waste time with what he called my dramatics. Dr. Campos agreed smoothly, said that was perfectly acceptable, that this was a legal matter now anyway. The meeting was set for 2 days later at Dr. Campos's office. Mateus said he'd be there but would stay out of sight. He wanted to see Gabriel's face when the lawyer laid out everything we knew. He wanted to watch my son realize that the helpless old woman he'd mocked had found teeth. I asked Mateus why he was doing all this, spending his time and money on my problems. He looked at me like I'd asked why the sun rose in the east. He reminded me of the night we met, how I'd found him in that parking garage, brought him home, made him soup, given him my son's old room without asking anything in return. He said Gabriel had always resented sharing me, had always treated Mateus like an inferior replacement. But now, Mateus smiled grimly, Gabriel was about to learn what a mistake that was. Because while Gabriel had been busy forgetting where he came from, Mateus had been busy building something real. And when you betray someone who truly loves you, sometimes karma doesn't come alone. Sometimes karma brings a helicopter. The morning of the meeting, I woke up at dawn with my stomach in knots. Sophia made me breakfast, but I could barely eat. Mateus arrived at 8, looking sharp in a navy suit, carrying a leather folder thick with documents. He sat across from me at Sophia's kitchen table and went through everything one more time. His investigators had uncovered more than we'd expected. Gabriel hadn't just stolen from me. He'd been playing these games for years. 3 years ago, he'd convinced his wife's elderly aunt to invest in another fake company, taking 70,000 Rs she'd saved for medical expenses. When the aunt asked about returns, Gabriel claimed the business had failed due to market conditions. She died 6 months later, never knowing her nephew by marriage had simply spent her savings on a vacation to Europe. Mateus showed me the paper trail. Airline tickets, hotel bookings, restaurant charges, all dated exactly 2 weeks after the aunt's money transfer. I felt sick. This wasn't just about me. My son was a predator who targeted vulnerable people who trusted him. There was more. Gabriel's company, his real employer, had started an internal investigation 3 months ago. Money was missing from client accounts, not huge amounts, but enough to notice. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. The investigation was ongoing, but Gabriel's name was on the short list of suspects. If they found proof, he'd face criminal charges beyond anything I could bring against him. Mateus said this was leverage. Gabriel was desperate, cornered, one audit away from prison. Our offer wouldn't just save him from me. It would give him liquid assets to cover his tracks at work, maybe pay back what he'd stolen before anyone proved it. We weren't just offering Gabriel a way out. We were offering him his freedom. But there was something else. Something Mateus was almost reluctant to tell me. His investigators had also looked into Beatrice's background. She'd been married before, to a businessman in São Paulo. That marriage ended when her husband discovered she'd forged his signature on loan documents to buy luxury cars. He divorced her, reported the fraud, but she'd fled to Rio before prosecution. The case went cold because he didn't pursue it across state lines. He just wanted her gone. Gabriel had married a con artist without knowing it, or maybe knowing exactly what she was and recognizing a kindred spirit. Either way, they were a matched set. 2 beautiful people living in a beautiful house, drowning in beautiful lies. Dr. Campos called at 9. Gabriel had arrived early, clearly anxious. The lawyer said Gabriel looked polished as always, but kept checking his watch, kept asking how long this would take. Dr. Campos told Mateus to come to the office's back entrance in 20 minutes, that he'd positioned cameras in the conference room so Mateus could watch from an adjacent office. I asked if I should come too. Mateus shook his head gently, said this might be hard to watch, that maybe I should wait here with Sophia. But I refused. I needed to see this. I needed to watch my son's face when he realized the helpless old woman he'd discarded actually had power. We arrived at Dr. Campos's building through the parking garage. The law office took up the entire 10th floor, all glass walls and expensive furniture. A paralegal led Mateus and me to a small office adjacent to the main conference room. Through a one-way mirror, I could see Gabriel sitting at a long table, scrolling through his phone, looking bored and irritated. My son. I'd given birth to that man 40 years ago. I'd nursed him through colic and chickenpox and teenage heartbreak. I'd worked overtime for 3 years to pay for his private university. And now he sat there, annoyed that he had to spend 30 minutes dealing with the mess he'd made of my life. Dr. Campos entered the conference room, introduced himself formally, and took the seat across from Gabriel. He thanked Gabriel for coming, said he wanted to resolve this matter efficiently and discreetly. Gabriel leaned back, projecting confidence, and said he hoped this wouldn't take long because his mother tended to exaggerate situations. Dr. Campos opened his folder slowly, deliberately. He slid the first document across the table, the loan agreement Gabriel had signed. Gabriel barely glanced at it, said he was aware of the loan, that he'd pay it back when his business recovered. Dr. A. Campos asked which business Gabriel meant. Gabriel frowned, said the consulting firm he'd started. Dr. Campos slid another document across, a corporate registry search showing no such company existed. The color started draining from Gabriel's face. He stammered that there must be a mistake, that his company was registered, that his accountant handled those details. Dr. Campos nodded pleasantly and slid across another document, a complete financial analysis showing exactly where the 200,000 reais had gone. Hotel stays, designer stores, car payments, restaurant bills. Gabriel's hand trembled slightly as he scanned the pages. Dr. Campos kept his voice even, almost friendly. He explained that this constituted fraud, that using falsified business claims to obtain money under false pretenses was a criminal offense. He mentioned that the bank holding the loan was very interested in this information, and that they had certain legal remedies available when collateral was destroyed and borrowers had misrepresented their financial situations. Gabriel found his voice, said his mother had signed those papers voluntarily, that she'd understood the risks. Dr. Campos agreed calmly, said that was true, but he wondered if Gabriel understood his risks. He slid across the investigation report about the missing client funds at Gabriel's actual workplace. I watched my son's face go white. He started to speak, stopped, started again. He demanded to know where Dr. Campos got that information, said it was confidential, that the lawyer had no right to it. Dr. Campos simply said that when building a case, one looks at all relevant factors of character and financial desperation. These details painted a concerning picture, didn't they? Gabriel's polish cracked. He asked what Dr. Campos wanted. The lawyer explained patiently, "My client, your mother," he emphasized, had lost everything. Her home was destroyed. Her son had refused to help her. She'd discovered her son had defrauded her. She was within her rights to press charges, to report everything to his employer, to inform the bank of the misrepresented loan purpose. But, Dr. Campos continued, his client was willing to offer Gabriel something unexpected, a chance to make this disappear. Not forgiveness, Gabriel should understand that, but a business transaction. Gabriel would sign over assets equal to the loan value plus damages for the destroyed collateral. In return, all potential legal action would cease. The bank wouldn't be informed. His employer wouldn't receive an anonymous tip about these interesting financial coincidences. Gabriel's jaw worked silently. He finally asked what assets. Dr. Campos slid across a prepared agreement. The Leblon house was mortgaged, so that was useless. But Gabriel had investment accounts, his luxury cars, Beatrice's extensive jewelry collection. The agreement detailed exactly what would be transferred and when. Gabriel exploded. He shouted that Dr. Campos couldn't force him to give up everything, that his wife would never agree, that this was extortion. Dr. Campos remained perfectly calm, said it wasn't extortion to offer someone the chance to settle legitimate debts and avoid legitimate prosecution. Gabriel was free to refuse, of course. Dr. Campos would simply proceed with filing formal charges and letting the various interested parties know about Gabriel's fascinating financial activities. My son looked like he might be sick. He asked for time to think, to talk to his wife, to consult his own lawyer. Dr. Campos said he had 24 hours. After that, the offer expired and legal proceedings began. He stood, handed Gabriel a copy of all the documents, and left the room. Through the mirror, I watched Gabriel sit there alone, shaking. He pulled out his phone, made a call. I couldn't hear what he said, but I could see his face, panic, rage, fear cycling across it. Then he stood abruptly and left. Mateus turned to me, asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I wasn't sure that was true. That was my son falling apart in that conference room, the baby I'd held, the child I'd raised. And I felt not quite satisfaction, not quite grief. Something complicated and painful between the two. Dr. Campos joined us, looking pleased with how it had gone. He said Gabriel would likely try to negotiate, to buy more time, but that we shouldn't give any ground. Desperation made people reckless, and Gabriel was desperate now. The lawyer predicted we'd hear from him within 12 hours. We heard from him in 3. Gabriel called Dr. Campos's office, asked to meet again, said he needed to discuss the terms. Dr. Campos told him there were no negotiations. The terms were set. Gabriel could accept or reject. Gabriel's voice reportedly turned pleading. He said he couldn't just sign over everything without talking to his wife, that Beatrice would leave him if she lost her jewelry and lifestyle. Dr. Campos, with perfect cold professionalism, suggested that Gabriel should have considered his wife's reactions before defrauding his mother. Gabriel hung up. That night, Mateus took me to dinner at a quiet restaurant. He said regardless of what Gabriel chose, I needed to know something. I was coming to live with him. He'd bought a house 2 years ago in the mountains near Petropolis, had been rattling around in it alone, would be honored if I'd share it. He'd set up a full suite on the ground floor, private entrance, everything I needed. I started to protest that I couldn't accept such generosity, but Mateus stopped me. He said I'd given him a home when he was 12 and scared and alone. Now he was 38 and successful and wanted to return what I'd given him: safety, family, a place to belong. He told me to let him do this, that denying him would hurt more than anything Gabriel had done. So I agreed, tears streaming down my face. And that night, for the first time since the fire, I fell asleep feeling something other than despair. I felt something that might have been hope. Gabriel didn't call back for 2 days. Dr. Campos said this was normal. Gabriel was probably scrambling, trying to find a way out, maybe consulting lawyers who were telling him he had no good options. The deadline was approaching, and the silence felt heavy. On the afternoon of the second day, something unexpected happened. Beatrice called Dr. Campos's office. She wanted to meet with me directly, said this was between women and didn't require lawyers. Dr. Campos immediately said no, that any communication needed to go through him. Beatrice insisted, said she just wanted to talk, to understand my side, to see if there was a compromise that worked for everyone. Mateus was furious when he heard. He said Beatrice was trying to manipulate me, to use emotional appeals that wouldn't work on lawyers. He told me to absolutely refuse any contact. But something in me was curious. I wanted to look Beatrice in the eye, wanted to see what kind of woman convinced my son to abandon his mother in her worst moment. Against everyone's advice, I agreed to meet her. Dr. Campos insisted on being present, and Mateus said if I was going to do this foolish thing, it would happen somewhere public with him watching nearby. We arranged to meet at a cafe in Ipanema the next morning. Beatrice arrived 15 minutes late, wearing clothes that probably cost more than the loan she was trying to weasel out of repaying. She air-kissed Dr. Campos like they were old friends, then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said I looked better than when I'd appeared at their door, clearly had somewhere comfortable to stay, so maybe things weren't as desperate as I'd claimed. Dr. Campos stiffened. I kept my voice level and told her my situation was exactly as desperate as I'd claimed. That losing everything you own tends to be genuinely desperate, regardless of whether someone offers you a guest room afterward. Beatrice's smile tightened. She said she wanted to explain something about Gabriel. He was under tremendous pressure at work. The economy was difficult. They had obligations, a daughter to raise. The business he'd started had legitimate potential, but needed more time to develop. If I would just be patient, they'd pay me back everything, with interest. But the terms Dr. Campos proposed were impossible. They'd be left with nothing, unable to maintain their home or lifestyle. I asked if she was serious. My house had burned down. I'd lost 40 years of possessions, memories, security. I'd called my son for help, and he'd laughed at me. And she was worried about maintaining their lifestyle? Beatrice's eyes flashed. She said I was being emotional, not thinking practically. If we bankrupted them, I wouldn't get my money back anyway. But if we worked together, gave them time, everyone would benefit eventually. Dr. Campos interrupted smoothly. He asked Beatrice if she was aware that Gabriel's business never existed, that he'd fabricated the entire story to obtain the loan. Beatrice blinked, said that was ridiculous, that Gabriel would never lie about something like that. Dr. Campos slid the corporate registry search across the table. I watched Beatrice's face as she read it. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw something underneath. Not surprise, but calculation. She'd known. Maybe not the specific details, but she'd known Gabriel was lying about where the money came from. She looked up, recovered her smile, and said there must be some paperwork error. Then she tried a different approach. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something meant to sound intimate and sincere. She told me she understood I was hurt, that Gabriel had handled things badly. But did I really want to destroy my relationship with my son, my only child? Did I want my granddaughter to grow up hearing that her grandmother had ruined her family? There were ways to resolve this that didn't involve legal action and bitterness. Something cold settled in my chest. This woman was trying to use my granddaughter, a child I barely knew because they'd kept her from me, as emotional blackmail. I asked Beatrice how many times they'd invited me to see my granddaughter in the past year. She waved the question away like it was irrelevant. I pressed, how many times? She admitted maybe they'd been busy, but that could change if we worked together now. Dr. Campos made a note on his pad, said that attempting to use a minor child as leverage in debt negotiations was inadvisable. Beatrice's pleasant facade cracked further. She said lawyers always made things more complicated than necessary, turned family matters into business transactions. I told her my son had already turned this into a business transaction when he used my house as collateral for a fake company. Beatrice stood abruptly, said this meeting was pointless if I was going to be unreasonable. She told me I was a bitter old woman who couldn't accept that her son had his own life now, that I was trying to punish him for being successful. She said Gabriel had warned her I was difficult and manipulative, that I'd always been jealous of their happiness. I felt like she'd slapped me. Dr. Campos stood as well, said this meeting was over, that Ms. Beatrice could communicate any legitimate settlement offers through proper legal channels. Beatrice grabbed her designer purse, shot me a look of pure venom, and said I'd regret this. They had friends, connections, ways of making sure this blew back on me. Then she left, her heels clicking sharply across the cafe floor. Mateus appeared from a nearby table where he'd been sitting with his back to us. He'd heard everything. His expression was dangerous. He said Beatrice had just threatened me in front of witnesses, that between that and everything else, we now had grounds to make Gabriel's life substantially more difficult if he pushed back. But I felt shaken. Despite everything, some part of me had hoped Beatrice might show a shred of decency, might acknowledge the wrong they'd done. Instead, she'd confirmed she was exactly what Mateus's investigators had revealed. A con artist who'd found another con artist, and together they'd built a life on lies and other people's money. Dr. Campos walked me to Mateus's car, said Beatrice's behavior had actually helped our case. If this ended up in court, her threatening language and admission that they could pay, eventually, proved they had assets to leverage. They were just choosing not to. The lawyer seemed energized by the confrontation. I just felt exhausted. That evening at Sophia's apartment, I asked Mateus something I'd been avoiding. I asked what would happen if Gabriel called our bluff, if he refused to settle and forced us into actual prosecution. Would Mateus really spend months or years fighting this legal battle for me? It seemed like so much effort, so much money, for something that might never be fully recoverable. Mateus looked at me for a long moment. Then he told me a story I'd never heard before. He said when he was 13 and living in my house, Gabriel had come home from university one weekend. Gabriel had found Mateus in the kitchen making breakfast and asked what the street rat was doing eating their food. I'd overheard and told Gabriel if he ever spoke that way again, he could find somewhere else to spend his university breaks. Mateus said that moment had defined something for him. He'd watched me choose defending a strange kid over keeping peace with my own son. He'd seen me willing to sacrifice my relationship with Gabriel to do what was right. And he'd sworn to himself that if he ever had the chance, he'd prove I'd made the right choice. That the scared kid from the parking garage would grow into someone who'd protect me the way I'd protected him. So yes, Mateus said, he'd spend years fighting this, if necessary, because some debts could never be repaid with money, only with loyalty. And loyalty was something Gabriel had never understood, but Mateus had learned in my kitchen over scrambled eggs 25 years ago. I hugged him and cried. Sophia, watching from the doorway, wiped her own eyes. The deadline expired at midnight. Dr. Campos had been clear. If Gabriel hadn't agreed to the settlement by then, we'd proceed with filing formal charges in the morning. At 11:47 p.m., the lawyer's phone rang. Gabriel's attorney, he'd finally hired one, requested an emergency extension, said they needed more time to review assets and prepare documentation. Dr. Campos, with Mateus and me listening on speaker, told Gabriel's lawyer there would be no extension. The terms expired in 13 minutes. Gabriel could sign the agreement tonight or face prosecution tomorrow. The choice was his, but the clock was running. At 11:56 p.m., Gabriel's lawyer called back. His client agreed to the terms. They'd sign whatever needed signing first thing in the morning. Dr. Campos confirmed the appointment for 9 a.m., said we'd need all parties present, all documents prepared. The lawyer agreed and hung up. Mateus smiled grimly. I felt something that wasn't quite victory, more like grim satisfaction. My son was going to pay for what he'd done, not everything he deserved, but something. It would have to be enough. The signing was scheduled for 9 in the morning, but I woke up at 5, couldn't get back to sleep. Sophia found me in her kitchen, made coffee, sat with me in comfortable silence. She said whatever happened today, I'd come out of it stronger than when I went in. I wanted to believe her. Mateus arrived at 7:30, looking sharp and serious. He'd brought me a new outfit, professional, dignified, the kind of clothes that said I wasn't a victim anymore. We drove to Dr. Campos's office in silence, the morning traffic barely registering. The conference room was set up like a stage. Dr. Campos had arranged every document in perfect order, each pile representing a piece of Gabriel's assets that would transfer to me. The investment accounts, the luxury vehicles, the jewelry. A notary sat ready to witness and seal each signature. Gabriel arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, his new lawyer beside him. My son looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, suit wrinkled, hands shaking slightly. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His lawyer, a nervous young man who looked fresh out of law school, kept glancing at the documents like they might bite him. Beatrice was conspicuously absent. Gabriel's lawyer explained she'd refused to attend, that this was Gabriel's mess to clean up. I wondered if that meant she was preparing to leave him, or if she was just too proud to watch their lifestyle dissolve. Dr. Campos began methodically going through each document. Gabriel would sign over his investment portfolio, approximately 130,000 reais. He'd transfer ownership of both luxury vehicles, leased but with buyout options that would be exercised and immediately transferred to me to sell. And Beatrice's jewelry collection, currently stored in a safe deposit box, estimated value around 90,000 reais. Gabriel's lawyer tried weakly to negotiate, said surely we could reduce some of these requirements. Dr. Campos didn't even look up, just said the client had 24 hours to accept the terms and they'd expired. So actually, Gabriel was lucky we were proceeding with the original offer rather than adding penalty interest for the delay. The signing took 90 minutes. Each document required initials, signatures, notary stamps. Gabriel's hand shook so badly his signature was barely legible on the first few pages. By the end, he'd gone completely silent, face gray, looking like he might be sick. When it was done, Dr. Campos slid copies across to Gabriel's lawyer and said his client now had 10 business days to complete all transfers and provide proof of completion. If any deadline was missed, the entire agreement was void and criminal proceedings would begin immediately. Gabriel's lawyer nodded miserably and stood to leave. Gabriel stood too, finally looked at me directly. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. I watched him struggle, watched him realize there were no words that would fix this, no apology that would undo what he'd done. Finally, he just turned and walked out. I sat there feeling hollow. Mateus asked if I was okay. I told him I didn't know. I'd just watched my son sign away everything that mattered to him, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sadness, just a vast, empty numbness where love used to be. Dr. Campos started explaining the next steps, how the assets would be liquidated, how long it would take to convert everything to usable funds, how we'd monitor Gabriel's compliance. I tried to focus, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Mateus drove me back to Sophia's. I spent the rest of the day in the guest room, sleeping fitfully, waking with no idea what time it was. Sophia brought me food I couldn't eat. Mateus called twice to check on me, his voice worried. That evening, Gabriel's lawyer called Dr. Campos. There was a problem with the jewelry. When Gabriel had gone to the safe deposit box, it was empty. Beatrice had cleaned it out 3 days ago, the day after our cafe meeting. She'd taken everything, the jewelry, some cash Gabriel had kept there, important documents. She'd left a note that just said she wasn't going to prison for his mistakes. Dr. Campos immediately informed Gabriel's lawyer that this was Gabriel's responsibility to resolve, that the agreement required transfer of specific assets, and if those assets had been removed, Gabriel needed to replace their value from other sources. Gabriel's lawyer said his client didn't have other sources, that Beatrice had taken everything liquid they had. Mateus heard this news and made some calls. Within an hour, his investigators had located Beatrice. She'd driven to São Paulo, checked into an expensive hotel using cash. They'd tracked her phone, her credit cards, her movements. Mateus said we could have her arrested for theft, that taking items from a safe deposit box during active settlement negotiations was grounds for immediate legal action. But Dr. Campos had a different idea. He said instead of pursuing Beatrice criminally, which would take months, we should inform Gabriel that he now had 2 choices. Replace the jewelry value immediately from his remaining assets, which meant selling the Leblon house, or we'd prosecute both him and Beatrice, making sure his employer and every business contact knew exactly what they'd done. Gabriel's lawyer called back within the hour. Gabriel would sell the house. He was moving in with his parents-in-law, a fact that would have been funny if everything wasn't so devastating. The house sale would take 60 days, but Gabriel would provide a promissory note secured against the sale proceeds, notarized and legally binding. Dr. Campos agreed. More papers were drawn up, signed, sealed, and just like that, my son had lost everything. His investments, his cars, his wife, and soon his house. All because he'd thought he could steal from his mother and face no consequences. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about Gabriel at 5 years old, how he'd crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, how he'd bring me flowers he'd picked from the neighbor's garden, how he'd tell me I was the best mom in the world. Where had that boy gone? When did my son become someone who could look at me standing in front of his house, smelling like smoke and loss, and laugh? Mateus found me on Sophia's balcony at 3 a.m, staring at nothing. He sat beside me, didn't say anything, just sat. Finally, I asked him if I was a terrible person for doing this to my own son. Mateus was quiet for a long time. Then he said I hadn't done anything to Gabriel. Gabriel had done it to himself. All I'd done was refuse to be a victim. He reminded me that Gabriel had choices at every point. He could have paid back the loan. He could have helped me after the fire. He could have been honest about the fake company. He could have accepted responsibility. Instead, at every turn, he'd chosen cruelty, deception, selfishness. This wasn't me punishing Gabriel. This was consequences finding someone who'd spent years believing he was above them. I wanted to believe him, but that hollow feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A woman I didn't know came to Sophia's apartment, said her name was Isabella, that she was Beatrice's ex-husband's sister. She'd heard through family connections what was happening. Small world, old money circles, and she wanted to tell me something. Isabella said when Beatrice married her brother 15 years ago, she'd seemed perfect, beautiful, charming, from a good family. But within a year, her brother noticed money disappearing. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. When he confronted Beatrice, she cried, said she had a shopping problem, promised to get help. He believed her, even paid for therapy. But the stealing didn't stop. Beatrice forged his signature on loans, took jewelry from his mother, and sold it, even stole from the business accounts of his company. By the time Isabella's brother discovered the full scope, Beatrice had taken over 300,000 reais. He divorced her, reported the fraud, but Beatrice fled before prosecution. He didn't pursue it across state lines because he just wanted her gone, wanted to move on with his life. Isabella said she'd followed Beatrice loosely over the years, horrified to see her marry again, wondering if Gabriel knew what he was getting into. When she heard about our situation, she realized Beatrice had found another mark, someone else to bleed dry. She'd come to warn me that Beatrice wouldn't just disappear. Women like her always came back when they ran out of money, always found new victims. I thanked Isabella for the warning. After she left, I told Mateus and Dr. Campos. The lawyer said this information was valuable, that if Beatrice tried to surface again or interfere with the settlement, we now had documented history of her pattern. Mateus said his investigators would keep tracking her, make sure she stayed away from me. But I couldn't stop thinking about Gabriel. Had he known what Beatrice was? Had he been her victim too, or her accomplice? I wanted to believe my son had been manipulated, that Beatrice had corrupted him, but I knew that wasn't entirely true. Gabriel had been cruel to Mateus long before Beatrice existed. The seeds of what he'd become were planted early, maybe by my own failures as a mother. Sophia found me crying in the guest room that afternoon. She sat on the bed, held my hand, let me talk. I told her I kept wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd raised a son who could become Gabriel. Sophia said sometimes people made their own choices regardless of how they were raised, that I couldn't take responsibility for Gabriel's character failures. But mothers always blame themselves, don't they? We always wonder if we could have done something different, been someone better, somehow prevented the pain our children cause and suffer. Dr. Campos called that evening. Gabriel had completed the first round of transfers. The investment accounts were now in my name. The vehicles had been signed over. The promissory note for the house sale was executed and filed. Everything was proceeding exactly as agreed. Mateus said he'd start converting the assets to liquid funds, that within a month I'd have full access to everything. He'd already arranged for my move to his house in Petropolis. Movers would pack Sophia's guest room. A decorator had furnished my new suite with items he hoped I'd like. He said we could leave whenever I was ready. I realized I'd been living in limbo in Sophia's guest room, afraid to move forward, stuck between the life I'd lost and whatever came next. It was time to choose what came next. I told Mateus I was ready. Ready to leave this city where I'd lost everything and my son had shown me who he really was. Ready to start over in the mountains, in a house filled with love instead of ashes and betrayal. Ready to let Mateus give me the home Gabriel had refused. We moved to Petropolis on a Tuesday morning, the sky that perfect clear blue you only get in the mountains. Mateus's house sat on 2 acres of forest and gardens, a beautiful colonial structure he'd restored himself. My suite on the ground floor was larger than my entire old house. Bedroom, sitting room, private bathroom with a soaking tub, French doors opening onto a garden terrace. Mateus had furnished it perfectly. Soft colors, comfortable furniture, photographs he'd found in my old house debris. The fire department had let him search the ruins, and he'd recovered a few pictures that survived in a metal box. My parents' wedding photo, baby Gabriel. A picture of Mateus at 13, skinny and scared, standing in my kitchen holding a plate of food like he couldn't believe it was his. I cried when I saw that photograph framed on my new dresser. Mateus said he'd kept the original all these years, had made copies. He wanted me to remember that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about a woman who saw a scared kid and brought him home. Life fell into a rhythm over the next few weeks. Mateus left early for his office in Rio, returned by 7. We'd have dinner together, talk about our days, sit on the terrace watching the sunset. On weekends, he'd work in the garden while I read, or we'd drive to the local market, or just exist in comfortable companionship. The money from Gabriel's assets was converted and deposited in an account Mateus helped me open. 230,000 reais, more than the original loan, enough to rebuild not just financially, but emotionally. Mateus said I should take time deciding what to do with it, that there was no rush. I thought about buying a small house, but being alone seemed impossible now. I thought about investing it, but what did I need investments for at 68? Finally, I decided to do something Gabriel would have thought was stupid. I donated half to a shelter for homeless youth, the kind of place that would have helped Mateus if he'd had nowhere else to go. Mateus cried when I told him. He said that was the most perfect use of Gabriel's money he could imagine. Taking what Gabriel had stolen and using it to help kids Gabriel would have called street rats. Dr. Campos called one morning with news. Gabriel's house had sold, actually for more than expected. Apparently, the Leblon market was hot. The promissory note had been paid in full. Gabriel had completed every single term of the settlement agreement. Our business was concluded. The lawyer said Gabriel's attorney had mentioned that Gabriel and his daughter had moved to a small apartment in Campo Grande, that Beatriz had filed for divorce from São Paulo, that Gabriel had lost his job after the internal investigation found proof of his theft from client accounts. He hadn't been prosecuted. The company wanted to avoid publicity, but he'd been quietly terminated and blacklisted in the industry. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I just felt sad. That was my son, living in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood. Everything he'd built, demolished. That was my granddaughter growing up without the advantages Gabriel had fought so hard to give her. But Mateus pointed out something I needed to hear. Gabriel's daughter was actually better off now. She'd learned the value of honest work, real relationships, character over appearance. She wouldn't grow up like Gabriel had, thinking wealth and status were the only measures of worth. Maybe losing everything was the best thing that could have happened to that little girl. 3 months after we settled, I got a letter, physical letter, mailed to Mateus's house. Gabriel must have done some work to find the address. The envelope sat on my dresser for 2 days before I could open it. Inside was a single page, Gabriel's handwriting. Mom, I don't expect forgiveness. I know what I did. I know what I am. Beatriz is gone, my job is gone, everything is gone except Isabella and the knowledge that I destroyed my own life. But I want you to know something. You were a good mother. You did everything right. I became who I am despite you, not because of you. That's my failure, not yours. I hope you're happy. I hope Mateus takes care of you the way I should have. And I hope someday, maybe years from now, I can introduce Isabella to her grandmother properly. Not expecting anything, just hoping. Gabriel. I read it 3 times. Mateus found me on the terrace, letter in my lap, tears streaming down my face. He asked if I wanted to respond. I didn't know. What would I say? That I forgave him? I didn't. Not completely. That I hated him? I didn't. Not anymore. That I loved him? I did. But it was a complicated love now, bruised and wary. Mateus said I didn't have to decide anything today. The letter wasn't asking for response or action, just acknowledging truth. Maybe that was enough for now. Life continued. My garden bloomed. Mateus's business expanded. We fell into being family. The kind of family that chose each other rather than being born into obligation. Sophia visited often. She and I had become genuine friends. Dr. Campos stopped by occasionally, always bringing wine and stories about his cases. Then one afternoon, 8 months after the fire, something happened that changed everything again. I was in the garden, deadheading roses, when I heard a sound I'd only heard in movies, the unmistakable whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter blades. I looked up to see a sleek black helicopter descending into the clearing beyond Mateus's house, the kind of helicopter that screamed money and power. Mateus came running out of the house, phone in his hand, face alight with excitement I'd never seen before. He grabbed my hand, pulled me toward the landing helicopter, shouting over the noise that I had to come now, that this was important. The helicopter settled, blades slowing. The door opened, and a man in his 60s stepped out, tall, distinguished, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Gabriel's cars had. He saw Mateus and his face broke into a huge smile. They embraced like old friends, speaking quickly in Portuguese and English mixed together. Then the man turned to me. Mateus made introductions. This was Roberto Chen, his former commander from the military, now a retired general who'd gone into private sector consulting. Roberto was the one who'd given Mateus his start in business, who'd mentored him, who'd helped him build his company. And Roberto was in Brazil for 48 hours between assignments in Asia and Europe, and he diverted his helicopter specifically to meet me. Because Mateus had told him everything, and Roberto insisted on thanking the woman who'd saved his favorite soldier's life. We spent that evening talking on the terrace. Roberto, Mateus, Sophia, who'd driven up when she heard, even Dr. Campos, who joined us for dinner. Roberto told stories about Mateus in the military, how smart he'd been, how loyal, how he'd been the kind of soldier you wanted beside you in any situation. He said Mateus talked about me constantly, that every success Mateus had was built on foundations I'd laid when I took in a scared kid and treated him like family. As the night wore on and wine flowed, Roberto asked me something directly. Did I understand what Mateus had actually accomplished? Did I know that his company had contracts with 3 governments, that he consulted for Fortune 500 corporations, that his net worth was estimated at over 40 million reais? I nearly dropped my wine glass. I'd known Mateus was successful, but I'd thought he meant comfortable, secure, not wealthy, not powerful, not the kind of successful that flew around in private helicopters. Mateus looked embarrassed. He said numbers didn't matter, that success was meaningless if you forgot the people who helped you get there. Roberto laughed, said that was exactly the kind of thing I would have taught him to say. And then Roberto told me the real reason for his visit. He said he'd been following Gabriel's situation through Mateus, that he'd seen how my son had treated me. And Roberto wanted me to know something. He'd made a few phone calls. Gabriel's name was now flagged in every major financial institution in Brazil. If Gabriel tried to work in finance again, if he tried to open business accounts, if he tried anything involving other people's money, alarms would sound. Not illegal, Roberto assured me, just a professional courtesy network. Gabriel would have to rebuild in a different field, honestly, from the ground up. He'd have to learn what real work meant, what character meant, what it cost to repair a destroyed reputation. And maybe, Roberto said gently, that was the best thing for him. I didn't know what to say. These powerful men had quietly, efficiently, ensured my son couldn't hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt me. Part of me was grateful. Part of me worried that it was too harsh. But mostly, I was overwhelmed by the realization of what I was seeing. Mateus hadn't just succeeded. He'd built an entire network of loyalty and respect, and he was using it to protect me. That night, after everyone left and the house was quiet, I sat in my suite looking at that photograph of 13-year-old Mateus holding a plate of food. I'd given him scrambled eggs and toast and a safe place to sleep. He'd turned those gifts into a life, a career, a family. And when I needed him, he'd brought all of that power to bear protecting me, never asking for anything in return. Gabriel had my blood. But Mateus had my heart, and I finally understood that I'd been given a rare gift, the chance to see which mattered more. It's been 2 years since the fire. I'm 70 now, and my life looks nothing like I imagined it would at this age. Gabriel's trajectory has been exactly what Roberto predicted. Difficult, humbling, necessary. He works now as a financial analyst for a small accounting firm in Barra da Tijuca, making a fraction of what he used to earn. No more Italian suits or luxury cars. He lives in that modest apartment with Isabella, my granddaughter who's now 6 years old. About 8 months ago, Gabriel started sending letters, not asking for forgiveness or money, just updates about his life, about Isabella. He'd started therapy, was attending a financial recovery program for people who'd lost everything to their own mistakes. He wrote that looking at Isabella, watching her grow up, made him understand what he'd destroyed. Not the money or status, but the trust, the relationship, the possibility of me knowing my granddaughter. I didn't respond to the first 3 letters. The 4th one included a drawing Isabella had made, a rainbow house with stick figures she'd labeled Papai and Vovo. I cried for an hour holding that drawing. I responded to the 5th letter, just a card, nothing elaborate. I told Gabriel I was glad he was getting help, that I hoped he was learning what actually mattered in life. I said I wasn't ready to see him yet, but maybe someday I'd like to meet Isabella properly. Gabriel's response came immediately. He said he understood, that he'd wait as long as I needed, that he was just grateful I'd written back at all. He enclosed a photograph of Isabella at her Escola Pública, smiling gap-toothed in her uniform. She looked happy, not the manufactured happiness of rich kids in expensive schools, but genuine joy. 3 months ago, Gabriel asked if I'd be willing to video call with Isabella on her birthday. Just 5 minutes, just so she could meet her grandmother. I talked to Mateus about it for hours. He said it was my choice, that he'd support whatever I decided, but that maybe Isabella deserved to know I existed, even if Gabriel didn't deserve my presence in his life. So I made the call. Isabella was shy at first, hiding behind Gabriel's shoulder, but then she warmed up. She told me about her school, her friends, her favorite books. She asked if I liked butterflies because she loved butterflies, and her Popeye said I used to have a garden with lots of flowers. I told her about my garden here in Petropolis, how the butterflies visited every morning, and her eyes went wide with wonder. When Gabriel finally appeared on camera to say goodbye, he looked different. Thinner, older, but also somehow more present, less polished, more real. He thanked me quietly, said it meant everything to Isabella. Then he did something surprising. He thanked Mateus, who was standing just off camera. He said Mateus had been a better son than he'd ever been, and he was grateful I had someone who loved me properly. Mateus just nodded. Some grudges aren't worth holding, but some truths deserve acknowledgement. Beatriz, meanwhile, was arrested 6 months ago in São Paulo for running a real estate scam. Apparently, she'd convinced elderly investors to put money into luxury developments that never existed. She's awaiting trial, facing actual prison time. When Dr. Campos told me, I felt no satisfaction, just sadness at the waste of it all, a woman who could have been anything, who chose instead to be a predator. The money from Gabriel's settlement is mostly gone now, but in the best possible way. Half went to the youth shelter, like I mentioned. Another chunk funded a small scholarship program at the public school where Mateus and Gabriel both went, paying for books, supplies, and tutoring for kids whose families struggle. The rest I split between Sophia's charitable foundation that helps single mothers and a fund for elderly victims of financial exploitation. Mateus tried to argue I should keep more for myself, but I'm living in his house, eating his food, using his car when I need to go somewhere. What do I need money for? The best revenge against Gabriel's greed was proving that money's true value lies in what it can do for others. My days now have a rhythm I never expected to find. I wake early, have coffee on my terrace watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. I tend my garden, actual butterfly garden now, after Isabella's call inspired me. I volunteer twice a week at a local nursing home, reading to residents who remind me how lucky I am to have my health and mental clarity at 70. Mateus comes home for lunch most days. His office is only 30 minutes away, and he's arranged his schedule to maximize time at home. We cook together, experiment with recipes, laugh at our failures. On weekends, we explore mountain towns, visit local markets, live quietly and contentedly. Sophia visits every few weeks, sometimes bringing her grandchildren who call me Vovo Fernanda, even though we share no blood. Dr. Campos drops by monthly for wine and chess. Turns out we're evenly matched, which makes for entertaining evenings. Roberto Chen calls from whatever country he's in, always checking that Mateus is taking proper care of me, always telling me stories about Mateus's latest business triumphs. Last month, Mateus was interviewed by a national business magazine. They asked about his success, what drove him, what values guided his company. He said something that made me cry when I read it. I learned everything important from my mother. Not my birth mother, but the woman who brought me home when I had nowhere else to go. She taught me that real wealth is measured in loyalty, that power means protecting people who can't protect themselves, and that family is something you choose every day through your actions. Everything I've built rests on that foundation. The magazine printed a photo of us together in the garden, Mateus's arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling genuinely. Gabriel sent me the article without comment. I keep it in my dresser drawer next to Isabella's rainbow drawing. 3 weeks ago, on my 70th birthday, Mateus threw me a party. Small, intimate, Sophia and her family, Dr. Campos, Roberto who flew in specially, a few neighbors I'd befriended, and staff from the youth shelter whose programs I support. We ate, laughed, shared stories. At the end of the evening, Mateus stood and made a toast. He said 70 years ago I'd been born. 28 years ago I'd saved his life without knowing it. 2 years ago he'd gotten to return the favor. And today, he wanted everyone to know that I was the best thing that ever happened to him, and every success he'd achieved was because a nurse in her 40s had looked at a scared kid and said, "Come home with me." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. As people were leaving, my phone rang. Gabriel. I almost didn't answer, but Mateus nodded encouragingly. Gabriel wished me happy birthday, said Isabella had made me a card she'd mail tomorrow. Then he asked if maybe, possibly, sometime in the next few months, I'd be willing to meet Isabella in person, just at a park, just for an hour. He'd understand completely if the answer was no, but he had to ask. I looked at Mateus. He smiled, squeezed my hand, whispered that 70 was a good age for new beginnings. So I told Gabriel yes. Not yet, but soon. Maybe in the spring, when the butterflies were most active in my garden and Isabella could see them for herself. Gabriel's voice cracked. He thanked me, said I wouldn't regret it, said he was trying every day to become someone worthy of being my son again. I told him I hoped he succeeded, for Isabella's sake, if not his own. After I hung up, Mateus asked if I was sure. I said no. I wasn't sure about anything involving Gabriel, but I was sure about Isabella, who was innocent in all this, who deserved to know her grandmother. And I was sure that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or even fully trusting again. It just meant being willing to leave room for possibility. Now, as I sit on my terrace writing this, yes, writing it, because Mateus suggested I document this story, said it might help other elderly people facing exploitation, I can see my whole life from a different perspective. The fire didn't just destroy my house. It revealed the truth about my family, about what I'd built versus what I thought I'd built. It showed me that Gabriel was never the son I imagined, but Mateus was always the son I needed. It taught me that at 68, you can lose everything and still start over. That family isn't about blood or obligation, but about showing up when it matters. When the person who saved me landed in a helicopter, well, that's not quite accurate. Roberto's helicopter was symbolic, dramatic, the kind of detail that makes for good storytelling. But the real salvation happened months earlier, when Mateus answered my desperate call and said, "I'll be there in 90 minutes." That's when I was actually saved. By a man I'd fed scrambled eggs 28 years ago. By a boy I'd given a safe place to sleep. By someone who understood that love is a verb, not a noun, something you do, not something you claim. Gabriel panicked when he realized what he'd done because he finally understood consequences. But more than that, he panicked when he saw who Mateus had become, when he understood that the street rat he'd mocked was now a powerful man who'd moved heaven and earth to protect me. Gabriel had thought Mateus was beneath him. Instead, Mateus had become everything Gabriel pretended to be. Successful, respected, loyal, and genuinely good. The final irony? Gabriel's cruelty gave me the greatest gift. If he'd taken me in after the fire, if he'd shown even basic decency, I'd be living in his guest room on charity, grateful for scraps of his attention. Instead, I'm living in a beautiful home with someone who loves me, surrounded by genuine friends, with resources to help others, and with purpose beyond just surviving. I'm 70 years old. My house burned down. My son betrayed me. And somehow, impossibly, beautifully, I'm happier now than I've been in decades. If you're watching this, wherever you are, maybe you're facing your own betrayal, your own loss, your own moment of wondering if you can survive what's happened. I want you to know something. You can. Not just survive, but thrive. Not just endure, but flourish. Because family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up with a helicopter when you need saving, or scrambled eggs when you need feeding. And sometimes the person who saves you is the person you saved first, years ago, without even knowing you were planting seeds for your own rescue. So tell me, friend, where are you watching from today? What's your story of unexpected family, of loss that became gain, of endings that were actually beginnings? Drop a comment below, subscribe if this resonated with you, and know that whatever you're facing, you're not alone. We're all just humans trying to figure out what family means, one scrambled egg at a time.